Aren't they recruiting? Aren't these self-interested?
They're recruiting for the. They're recruiting for the CIA.
Using the CIA.
They're recruiting for the CIA. They're not recruiting for.
Common mindset.
They're recruiting for the CIA. They're not recruiting for Microsoft or Wall Street. This concentration on CIA atrocities is one of the techniques that's used to avoid criticism of the government of a real power. If you can blame something on the CIA, this kind of rogue outfit, then you do exactly what the government wants you to do. The CIA is there for what's called plausible deniability. It's the phrase that's used inside. So if the government wants to say, overthrow the Indonesian, if Washington wants to overthrow the government of Indonesia, you say, okay, the CIA did it. And then you can say, well, we don't have anything to do with it. That's just that rogue outfit if something goes wrong. The CIA is an agency of the executive branch of the government. They do what the executive branch of the government tells them to do. There's a long record, rich record, and there are some exceptions, but overwhelmingly, the CIA is just an agency of the executive which acts in ways to provide plausible deniability, to sort of keep us clean if something goes wrong. Then you blame them if something goes wrong. And that's true on case after case. So, yeah, when you talk about the CIA, you should think of that as a metaphor. It's a way of describing what the executive branch of the government is doing and the corporate backers of the executive branch, and they've got this agency which carries out the ugly stuff for them. And that's what secret agencies are like in most states. So I think one should be cautious about that. I mean, it's not wrong to blame the CIA for this, that, and the other thing, but remember, they're the hand that's not the brain.
We questioned President Obama's sincerity and veracity in saying he'll be working day and night for peace between Palestinians and Israelis.
Well, yeah, he probably said it somewhere, but that's like one of these statements, like Hitler's statement that we invaded Poland to protect ourselves from the wild terror of the Poles. I mean, these are perfectly predictable statements by every leader. I'm going to be working for peace and justice and trust in me and so on. So those are the kind of statements you ignore because they're meaningless. They're predictable. Every powerful leader will say the same thing, and they do. So you ignore it and pay attention to what he actually said. Well, it turns out that comes down to practically nothing. His campaign was very well designed so that it would be vacuous. His managers ran an extremely good campaign. It was so good that the advertising industry, which gives an award every year for the best marketing campaign of the year, they gave it to the Obama campaign last year. And high executives, you get quoted in the business press, were saying, really exultant. They were saying, we've been marketing candidates like commodities ever since Reagan, and this is the best we've ever done. It's going to change the atmosphere in corporate boardrooms, new ways of doing things and so on. And it sells in Europe too. If you watch the exultant campaign, well, if you read the New York Times, for example, a couple of days ago, it was a front page picture of the different dresses that Michelle Obama wore. In the morning, she wore a dress from this fancy designer, and the afternoon, it was some other fancy designer, and all the young people loved it, and they wanted to touch Obama and so on. Yeah, that's good marketing campaigns. But and it was the same right through the campaign. If you've paid attention, so It was basically vacuous. I mean, like on Israel-Palestine, literally the only statement he made was the one I quoted on Sderot, other than, the usual vacuous platitudes. I'll talk tomorrow about Obama in the Middle East, so I won't go into it now, but put it simply, he's probably more hawkish than Bush. If I understand, what's the current situation of the Norman Finkelstein case?
Yeah, does he have anything upcoming work? And also maybe briefly describe the situation?
Well, the situation is that he's written extensive and outstanding work on Israel-Palestine, international law, other things. And he was coming up for tenure at DePaul University. and there was a huge attack on him, made kind of like a jihad to try to destroy him. And he came pretty close to being appointed, despite it. But at the last minute, for whatever reason, the administration overturned the faculty, the faculty recommendation to promote him to tenure. Okay, now that is an attack on academic freedom, of course, but it's a very special case. The special case has to do with a lunatic at Harvard Law School named Alan Dershowitz, who makes old-fashioned Stalinism look pale, literally. I won't go through it. But Finkelstein made the mistake of writing a book. He's a very meticulous, careful scholar, and nobody can ever find anything wrong with what he says. But he wrote a book in which he ran through Dershowitz's best-selling apologetics for Israel and showed that it was just a tissue of lies and fabrications and slanders and support for atrocities and so on. And it was a very careful, meticulous job. Now, Dershowitz is a lawyer. He actually wrote a book called something like Advice to Young Lawyers. And he gives some good advice. He says, if you have a client and you know that he's guilty of sin, what you should do is anything you can up to outright violation of law to get him clear him. Okay, now Dershowitz has two clients, himself and Israel. Okay, and he acts on his own advice. So that he knows he can't respond to what Finkelstein wrote. So therefore he launched into a campaign of vilification and slander of a kind I've never seen. I don't even think you could find it in the Stalinist literature. I mean, just to give you an example, Norman's mother, who he reveres, is a survivor of Auschwitz. Okay, so Finkelstein actually published an article in which he says she survived Auschwitz because she was a capo, a collaborator with the Nazis. This is. See if you can find anything like that in the Stalinist literature or anywhere. That's the kind of thing that was going on, and he probably managed to mobilize funders and others, and of course the most vulgar parts of the Jewish community got involved, and the Catholic university is vulnerable because they can be accused of anti-Semitism. Okay, that's one of the background weapons, anti-Semitism. And somebody mentioned this before, I don't know, maybe you, but this use of the notion of anti-Semitism is extremely cynical. And it's conscious. So the leading Israeli statesman, the most admired statesman, Abba Eban, admired particularly because he had an Oxford accent. That always helps, But he was considered very distinguished, aristocratic Englishman. But he wrote an article once in one of the American Jewish journals, Congress Weekly, in which he explained, this was like 30 years ago, he explained to the American Jewish community what their task was. He said their task is to show that any criticism of Zionism, which means criticism of Israel, is either anti-Semitism or the result of neurotic Jewish self-hatred. Okay, that amounts to 100%, okay? So that's your task. And that's exactly what they do. Incidentally, I had two examples of neurotic anti-Jewish self-hatred. I was one, and the other was I.F. Stone, who was a dedicated Zionist all his life. But because we were critical of Israel. So, and in fact, in Hebrew, there are two words for propaganda. There's the word that means propaganda, which is used for everybody, and the word that's used for themselves, which translates as explanation. See, the assumption is that everything we do is so obviously correct that all we have to do is explain it to the goyim, to the non-Jews, and then they'll understand. And that's the line constantly, you read this stuff. So that's Abba Eban's advice. So every criticism is either anti-Semitism or Jewish self-hatred. Can't be. What else could there be, since everything that's done is obviously right? Finkelstein is, he'll have a very hard time teaching after this because he's been defamed badly. But he's getting on. He's writing a lot, very good stuff. He's giving hundreds of talks all over the place. He's got a new book almost out, I guess. Pretty soon it'll be out. And, both here and abroad. It's not the best situation in the world, but he's making out okay. Paraphrase.
What are your sources of inspiration?
Sources of inspiration? What people have done. Like take, say, the Palestinians. They've survived. It's astonishing, That's a source of inspiration. To have survived an attack like this that goes back a century, but is intensifying in recent years, and to still be struggling to get your voice heard like Rita's doing, that's inspiring. And people do that all over the world. Here too. Just take here where the struggles are much easier, we're privileged. But a lot has been achieved. Take, say, the presence of this audience. A couple of years ago, you could barely get 10 people in a room to hear about this. And if you had them, the talk would be broken up. I could give you examples from my own background. Take, say, take the last election. I didn't like any of the candidates. That's probably clear to you. But nevertheless, just consider the fact that the Democratic Party had two candidates, a woman and an African American. 40 years ago, you couldn't dream of that. 10 years ago, you couldn't dream of it. Where did it come from? Well, it came from activism, mostly of young people, engaged, dedicated people who just made the country more civilized, far more civilized. Take my own university, MIT. When I got there 50 years ago, if you walk down the halls, it was obedient white males, well-dressed, doing their work, deferential, so on. You walk down the halls today, it kind of looks like this. Half women, third minorities, informal relations among people, a lot of act, not as much as I'd like to see, but a lot of activism on all kind of things. All right, that's happened all over the country. Issues that are now concern people didn't even exist 40 years ago. Take, say, the solidarity movements, which grew up around Central America in the 80s, mostly not in the elite centers. It was like churches in Kansas and that kind of, a lot of it from evangelicals. That's a real breakthrough in the history of imperialism. Nothing like that's ever happened. Nobody in England or France or Germany or the United States or whatever ever dreamed of going to the targets of imperial attack, living in the villages, trying to help people, and even to offer them some protection with a white face. But, thousands of Americans did that in the 80s. That's really significant. It's a reflection of a major cultural change. You're never going to read about this in the newspapers. It's the last thing they want, But it's changed the society. Well, that's inspiring. And these people worked hard and faced a lot of danger. Not the kind of danger you face in the third world, but real, and put aside easy, lucrative careers to devote themselves to these things. Okay, that's inspiring. And you can go on and on. Before the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, which killed maybe 20,000 people, destroyed much of southern Lebanon and Beirut. Incidentally, all of this is always with the backing of the United States. In Gaza and in the invasion of Lebanon, the U.S. provides the arms. The U.S. vetoed Security Council resolutions to try to call for a ceasefire. It's just steady, constant support for atrocities and violence. Now, there's a pretext for the 1982 invasion, too. And you can read it in everything, anything you read, you see the same thing. New York Times, government, it's universal. Israel invaded because they had to protect themselves from attacks by the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, from Lebanon, which was making life impossible for people in the Galilee. Well, here's an even more dramatic case than this one of how repeated lying can turn truth into its opposite. fact of the matter that time, and there's no dispute about it, in the historical record at least, is that there was actually a U.S.-sponsored ceasefire in the summer of 1981, and the Palestinians kept to it rigorously. Nothing. Israel was, on the other hand, was constantly bombing, severely, killing a lot of people, plainly trying to elicit some kind of a Palestinian response, which could be used as the pretext for the planned invasion. Well, they couldn't get a pretext, so they finally just invaded with a pretext so ludicrous that you could hardly keep from collapsing in ridicule. But they bought, and it was not concealed in Israel, not just by Haaretz, but the government conceded it. Said, yeah, this is a war for the West Bank. We have to stop the Palestinian offers of negotiations and diplomacy, which are embarrassing. We don't want diplomacy. We don't want negotiations. We got to get them to stop. So we'll drive them out of Lebanon. And we'll call the operation Peace for Galilee, which is what it was called, and we'll count on the American intellectual community, media, and so on, to reverse the story, which is pretty much what happened. In fact, when the Israeli bombings were occasionally reported, it was extremely revealing. So there was one bombing, major bombing, I think around April or so, where they killed a couple of dozen people. And the Washington Post actually reported it for once and said something like, this is not a time for sermons to Israel. It's a time for compassion for Israel's anguish, when they killed a couple more dozen Palestinians with no pretext. Well, that's, you can go on with this over and over. It's not just the media, it's the intellectual community, it's the government, and so on.